Hello everyone, welcome to the Science Buffer. I'm your host, Allison Lamoureux. Today's episode will be discussing news from Stanford about a new science art initiative, along with the United Launch Alliance or ULA launch, and our feature story on the Apollo and Artemis missions. So kick back and relax as we dive into the newest news and interesting stories of all things science. The first news story that I wanted to share was an interesting new initiative over at Stanford University here in California that blends science and art through a new School of Sustainability Artist Residency program. Stanford will be hosting Mark Sosowski as its first artist for this program. The project will explore and envision research that's being done at Stanford on the Southern Ocean. The second news story that I wanted to cover was an update to the United Launch Alliance's launch window. The launch was originally supposed to take place on May 6th, but unfortunately was scrubbed during the countdown. Originally, NASA and Boeing were looking at a launch window of May 17th. However, they did recently update on Friday, May 17th, that they are looking to have the launch window be on May 25th. So hopefully we'll be seeing that launch this weekend. I wish ULA and NASA the best of luck, and we hope to see that launch happening soon.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
This is the very much abridged story of how the United States sent astronauts to the moon over 50 years ago, and how they plan on sending them back to the moon in just a few years. About 6 years ago, right after I graduated from high school, my family and I took a trip to Florida to visit some family. While we were there, we ended up going to Cape Canaveral to visit Kennedy Space Center. It was really exciting as someone who is really interested in NASA and space exploration to be able to go and see where a lot of the history of the program started. We got to walk through the rocket garden and see all of the rockets that were utilized in missions past, and we even got to take a bus tour which took us past some of the launch pads and even by the vehicle assembly building. If you've seen the vehicle assembly building in person, you will totally understand it is a massive building and it's so amazing to see. And it was so exciting to learn more about NASA's history and our space program's history. So I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive more into that and kind of look to where we're going in the future in just a few years. Our story begins all the way back at the beginning of the Cold War between the United States of America and the USSR, or the Soviet Union, with the space race. Now, I am by no means a political historian, so the finer details of the Cold War, I will leave that to the political historians. But it's important to note that the space race and the Cold War really did set off and start our programming for human spaceflight. Now, two things to note. This story does very much come from a United States of America perspective. I am an American, so a lot of what I will be telling will be from the side of the USA. The other thing to note is the Soviet Union did have many of the first space firsts, so it's important to acknowledge that as well to really see where our improvements and development as a space flight program came from. Now, the Soviet Union had their cosmonauts, and the United States and NASA had their astronauts. And like I mentioned, the USSR had many of the first space firsts. They had the first human in space, the first satellite, and even the first space station, just to name a few. Now, the first human ever in space was cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, who became the first human in space in April 1961. And fun fact, he beat Alan Shepard to be the first human in space by about 1 month. While working on this abridged history of the Apollo and spaceflight programs, I read a retrospective analysis by Roger D. Launius, who explained that the original space program would have taken place over a much longer period of time. However, after Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, and according to some scholars, possibly even the Bay of Pigs invasion, President Kennedy switched his approach and began seriously considering a lunar landing much sooner. In May 1961, he made it official by addressing Congress and giving the announcement that we would be landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Now, before there was the Apollo program, we have to start all the way back in the early 1960s with Project Mercury, or the Mercury program. This is a program that lasted from 1961 to 1963 and really built our foundation to even getting humans up into space. March to the Moon, a digital repository that was developed between Arizona State University and NASA's Johnson Space Center, states the Project Mercury objectives as follows, quote, "The objectives of the program, which made 6 manned flights from 1961 to 1963, were specific: to orbit a crewed spacecraft around Earth, to test humans' ability to function in space, the successful re-entry and recovery of the orbital spacecraft and crew," end quote. So, as you can see, Mercury was really about getting us to space, the first crucial steps towards a lunar landing program. Now, Project Mercury had a total of 6 manned missions that saw the first Americans in space and orbit, with Alan Shepard being the first American in space and John Glenn being the first American in orbit. And less than 1 month after Alan Shepard's flight, President John F. Kennedy made the announcement that we would be going to the moon. Following Project Mercury, we have the Gemini program, which ran from 1964 to 1966. And just as Mercury was instrumental in getting us to space, Gemini was instrumental in testing our crew and spacecraft. March to the Moon defines Gemini's goals as follows, quote, "The major objectives assigned to Gemini, according to the Kennedy Space Center, were to test an astronaut's ability to fly long-duration missions up to 2 weeks in space, to understand how spacecraft could rendezvous and dock in orbit around the Earth and the Moon, to perfect re-entry and landing methods, to further understand the effects of longer space flights on astronauts," end quote. So, Gemini really served to prep us for the Apollo program. The Gemini program had a total of 14 missions, with 12 of them being manned, and we had some of our first space firsts with the Gemini program. There was the first rendezvous with Gemini 6A and 7 and the first docking of Gemini 8. We also had many spacewalks, or EVAs, called extravehicular activities. And we also set multiple records for duration in space with Gemini 5 and 7. While Mercury and Gemini were manned missions that really were instrumental in laying the foundation for the Apollo program, it's important to note some of the unmanned missions that were also instrumental in getting us to the moon, specifically the Ranger and Surveyor programs. Ranger was a program that ran from 1961 to 1965. It took photos of the moon's surface, and some of the missions even tested some of the launch vehicles we were planning to use for the Apollo program. It also helped us get a better understanding of what the moon's surface was like through those photos. After the Ranger program, the Surveyor program followed its footsteps from 1966 to 1968. With the Surveyor program, they had actual soft landings on the moon, and again were testing launch vehicles. Surveyor also collected samples from the surface and made observations. After the Mercury and Gemini programs, we of course have the Apollo missions, where we would send a man to the moon for the very first time in human history. The Apollo missions had a total of 15 missions during its duration, with 11 crewed missions and a total of 6 lunar landings. The Apollo program utilized a lunar orbit rendezvous in order to launch and send someone to the moon. This was the method that was chosen between 3 different possible rendezvous options. Now, Apollo astronauts flew on either the Saturn IB or Saturn V rockets to get them all the way up to that lunar orbit. NASA states its goals for the Apollo program were, quote, "establishing the technology to meet other national interests in space, achieving preeminence in space for the United States, carrying out a program of scientific exploration of the moon, developing human capability to work in the lunar environment," end quote. So while Apollo did in fact get humans on the moon, it wasn't just about getting us to the moon, but also exploring the lunar surface that we could get to and what kind of research and samples we could bring back. Apollo flight missions began in 1967 with Apollo 1. We would land our first humans on the moon 2 years later in 1969, and the final lunar landing mission would occur in 1972. The Apollo program had a total of 15 missions, and while it'd be wonderful to go through every single mission and go through its objectives and what happened, that would take us a lot of time. So I wanted to highlight some of the important missions that helped develop our space program to what it is today. The first mission of the Apollo program was designated AS-204, which was scheduled to fly in February 1967. However, in January of that year, during a pre-mission test called the Plugs Out test, a fire spread in the command module, which led to the loss of the lives of the mission's 3 astronauts, Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee. After the tragedy, AS-204 was posthumously named Apollo 1 in honor of its crew. This tragedy did lead to more improvements for the safety of crews and future missions, including changing the mechanism of the hatch door in the command module and making the astronaut spacesuits more flame resistant. After the tragedy of Apollo 1, the next Apollo mission wouldn't be until the uncrewed Apollo 4 mission. Apollos 4 through 6 were uncrewed missions, and the first crewed mission after the tragedy would be Apollo 7. Now, our next key mission I wanted to highlight is Apollo 10, which ran from May 18th to May 26th for a total of approximately 8 days. Apollo 10 served as the dress rehearsal mission for Apollo 11's lunar landing. Its crew consisted of Thomas Stafford, Eugene Cernan, and John Young. During the mission, Stafford and Cernan flew down within miles of the lunar surface, made observations, and then returned back up to John Young and the command module. During this mission, Thomas Stafford and Eugene Cernan flew in lunar module Snoopy, and John Young commanded service module Charlie Brown. Yes, that Charlie Brown and Snoopy. NASA and Snoopy and Charles Schultz have a very unique and interesting partnership. Snoopy was brought on as a mascot in 1968. And while he features on many posters throughout the agency, one of the things he's most known for within the agency is the Silver Snoopy Award. This award is awarded to people who work on NASA's missions in order to help improve safety in spaceflight missions, and it's become a bit of a tradition to bring the Silver Snoopy Award pins up into space on missions. Snoopy has also flown on other missions besides the Apollo missions. Of course, we can't go without talking about the most iconic and historical mission, Apollo 11, which saw the first humans land on the surface of the moon. It launched on July 16th, 1969, lasted for a total of 8 days, and its crew returned to Earth on July 24th. Its historical crew consisted of Commander Neil Armstrong, Lunar Module Pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Command Module Pilot Michael Collins. The lunar landing occurred on July 20th, 1969, just 4 days after launch. And the actual lunar EVA lasted approximately 2.5 hours. While on the surface of the moon, Armstrong and Aldrin would perform experiments, take samples of the lunar surface, and, of course, film their first steps on the moon. Now, while they brought stuff home to Earth from the moon, they also brought some stuff from the Earth to leave behind on the moon, including, quote, commemorative medallions bearing the names of the 3 Apollo 1 astronauts who lost their lives in a launch pad fire, and 2 cosmonauts who also died in accidents, end quote, along with a goodwill message disc and other items. The 3 astronauts would return to Earth as members of the history books on July 24th, 1969. After Apollo 11, the program would go on to have even more lunar landings, and with Apollo 13, an aborted mission due to failures in flight. The final mission of the Apollo program was Apollo 17, which ran from December 7th to December 19th of 1972, and would conclude the program after 5 years, and would be the last time a human would step foot on the moon for more than 50 years. Now that we've landed on the moon and had a successful lunar landing program, many were wondering, where do we go next after the moon? And Interestingly enough, thinking about these ideas had begun before we even landed on the moon. The Space Task Group was formed to develop more ideas and goals for future programs. And they had some pretty lofty and ambitious goals. They wanted to send humans to Mars in the 1980s, build moon bases and space stations, and even create a transportation that goes from and to the Earth. Now, unfortunately, President Nixon would only go through with one of these options, specifically the transportation system, which would become known as the Space Transportation System, STS, or better known as the Space Shuttle Program. President Reagan would later go on to approve the building of a space station, specifically the International Space Station, or Station. We did also unfortunately see the cut of 3 Apollo missions due to budgetary restrictions. It was originally planned that there would be missions up to Apollo 20. Now, from these scrapped Apollo missions came the Skylab, which was the first American space station. Now, it wasn't the first space station, as the Soviet Union's Soyuz was the first space station to be created, and the Soviet Union would also go on to develop Space Station Mir. Skylab ran for 3 missions from 1973 to 1974, and its primary objectives were to conduct science experiments in space and to observe long-term spaceflight effects on the human body. Other notable programs between the Apollo and Artemis missions include the Apollo-Soyuz rendezvous mission between the United States and the Soviet Union, which occurred in 1975, and would serve as some of the first steps toward international space ventures. The Space Shuttle program began development in the 1970s and was a form of reusable transportation between Earth and low Earth orbit. Some of the most notable Space Shuttle programs include the joint missions with the Russian Mir space station, the development and building of the International Space Station, and the deployment and repairs of the Hubble Space Telescope. Now, unfortunately, 2 shuttles and her crews were lost during the Space Shuttle program, specifically the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1986 and Space Shuttle Columbia in 2003. And the final flight of the Space Shuttle program would be on STS-135 aboard Space Shuttle Atlantis in 2011. This final flight would mark the 30 years of the Space Shuttle program. The International Space Station began development in the 1980s and had precursor missions in the late 90s with NASA-Mir joint missions. Construction of the ISS, or station, began in 1998 and has had astronauts and cosmonauts on board since 2000. 5 agencies worked together on the development of the station, specifically NASA, Roscosmos, the Russian Space Agency, JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, ESA, the European Space Agency, and CSA, the Canadian Space Agency. On board station, astronauts and cosmonauts conduct spacewalks and research. Station is planned to operate through 2030, which means that the program will have been operating for the same length of time as the Space Shuttle program. While station missions are still ongoing, many people are looking towards NASA's future of spaceflight, and specifically where are we going and when. This is where the Artemis program comes in. Artemis is an upcoming series of NASA missions that will bring us back to the moon. It'll utilize the Space Launch System, or SLS, the Orion spacecraft, the Human Landing System, and Gateway to bring us to the moon and beyond. It'll also see the first woman and the first person of color to step foot onto the surface of the moon, and will be exploring the moon's south pole. Artemis consists of 5 missions that will bring astronauts back to the moon and prepare for future missions beyond the moon. Artemis 1 occurred in 2022 and was a test mission to ensure the capabilities of the SLS, or Space Launch System, and Orion. The mission was deemed a success, and if you watched live, you might have seen Snoopy floating on board. Artemis 2 is an upcoming crewed mission. It'll be the first crewed mission of the Artemis program. The crew won't land on the moon for this mission, but they will orbit around the moon and test out the Orion spacecraft's maneuverability and handling during an in-flight demonstration. Its crew was announced in 2023 and is composed of 4 astronauts, 3 from NASA and 1 from the Canadian Space Agency. Reed Wiseman will serve as the Artemis 2 commander, Victor Glover as its pilot, Christina Cook and Jeremy Hansen as mission specialists. Artemis 3 will be the second crewed mission and the first mission to land humans on the moon in more than 50 years. It'll also utilize the Starship craft, which is the human landing system for this mission, developed by SpaceX. The lunar expedition is expected to last approximately 6.5 days. Artemis 4 will be the third crewed mission and second lunar expedition, and will also be used to help set up the Gateway Station, along with delivering one of the habitable modules called IHAB. Artemis 5 will be the fourth crewed mission and the third lunar expedition. And we'll also see the delivery and setup of ESA's eSprint, another one of the modules for the Gateway Station. Now, crews for Artemis 3 through 5 have not yet been announced, but I'm really looking forward to seeing who NASA chooses as the next generation of astronauts heading to the moon. Now, you might be wondering, when are we even going? And it's soon. While Artemis 1 took place in 2022, the program did see some postponements, so Artemis 2 is now slated to launch in late 2025, Artemis 3 for late 2026, and Artemis 4 for 2028. Artemis isn't the only program that NASA is currently working on. One of the programs they're working on right now is the Gateway Station, which is instrumental to Artemis missions and future long-term human spaceflight missions. Gateway will be the first space station in lunar orbit. All of our previous space stations were in low Earth orbit. It will also act as a hub for Artemis missions and potential future Mars missions. It's expected to be used by the crew of Artemis 4 and Artemis 5. Gateway will also serve as a collaboration between NASA, ESA, CSA, JAXA, and the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center, or MBRSC. 4 of these agencies are returning members from the ISS, and the MBRSC is a new member. There are a couple of differences between Gateway and Station. First, Gateway is smaller than the International Space Station, and it also holds a lunar orbit. They also plan to conduct new research, and Gateway will only be occupied during crewed missions. An interesting fact about Gateway is that it'll utilize what's called a near rectilinear halo orbit. It takes approximately 7 days for an object to complete this orbit, and it orbits from one pole of the moon to another like a necklace, according to NASA. This orbit will be utilized by Artemis 3 and beyond, with the Artemis 4 and 5 missions who will dock with Gateway in this orbit pattern. Another important aspect of the Artemis missions that'll carry on beyond just Artemis is the Artemis Accords. This is a treaty between multiple nations to ensure the peaceful and cooperative use of space for all mankind, and it has over, and counting, 30 countries that have signed the accords to date. NASA is also looking to utilize more commercial partners to develop commercial space stations and destinations. In a NASA press release, they explain, quote, NASA has signed agreements with 3 U.S. companies to develop designs of space stations and other commercial destinations in space, end quote. The release goes on to explain, quote, NASA seeks to maintain an uninterrupted U.S. presence in low Earth orbit by transitioning from the International Space Station to other platforms, end quote. Now, we've already seen NASA's trust and utilization of commercial programs for other missions, such as SpaceX and the United Launch Alliance and Boeing. So it'll be really interesting to see what companies come up with to develop their own space stations and how we use that for human spaceflight and exploration in the future. And finally, NASA's largest goal for its human spaceflight programs is to send humans to Mars. The Artemis missions and Gateway are paving the way towards this goal, but there's intermittent steps that need to be worked on before we can officially send humans to Mars. To do that, NASA utilizes what's called the Moon to Mars architecture. Quote, NASA's architecture approach distills agency-developed objectives into operational capabilities and elements that support science and exploration goals. Working with experts across the agency, industry, academia, and the international community, NASA continuously evolves that blueprint for crewed exploration, setting humanity on a path to the Moon, Mars, and beyond, end quote. How this architecture works is it has 4 specific stages or steps return humans both to the moon and on to Mars missions. Step 1 is human lunar return. Step 2 is foundational exploration. Step 3, sustained lunar evolution. And Step 4, humans to Mars. The Artemis missions are beginning to reach towards steps 1 and 2. These steps will eventually build on one another, with specific objectives or sub-architecture being met along the way and are crucial to reaching each of these steps. Another way that NASA is preparing to send humans to Mars is through the Crew Health and Performance Exploration Analog, or CHPEA. This is a set of 3 missions that'll focus on the human element of long-duration spaceflight and exploration. Specifically, quote, NASA will use research gained from CHPEA to determine how to best support crew health and performance while living on Mars during a long-duration exploration mission, end quote. This will be a simulation of what it's like to live on Mars and will be crucial in understanding how humans operate in long-term spaceflight missions. The flight to Mars is a very long one, and we want to make sure that our astronauts are well equipped to deal with any challenges that they face on their way to, on the surface of, and on their way home from the Red Planet. I hope you enjoyed listening to this abridged version of our missions to the moon and our future goals for space exploration. Thank you so much for joining me this week on the Science Buffer. If you like this episode, please feel free to share it on your favorite social media platform. As NASA says, quote, our voyage to the moon, Mars, and beyond has only just begun, end quote.